Welcome back to Green Box Politics, Episode 2. And I'm your host, Red Stick Mirage. So we will continue our investigation of American street history, look into the psychology, the mentality, the behavior of what's going on in the street underworld throughout North America, mainland North America at least. So the next person we will evaluate is someone by the name of Richard Wersche Jr., also known as White Boy Rick. Richard Wersche Jr., also known as White Boy Rick. And he was involved in certain street drug activity in Detroit, Michigan during the 80s, all right, the 1980s. So what we'll do is get a background, some background basic information on who this man is, understand a little bit of the nature of the activities he was involved in. And then we would do our esoteric or occult evaluation, where we look at, well, what were some of this guy's motivations to do what it is he did? And whenever I could do these tapes, no matter what your ethnicity or nationality is, everyone is welcome to, enjoy these videos because these are for educational and entertainment purposes. But if you are a so-called Black American male or man, and you grew up in the United States of America and you were born in one of the mainland states, this really is for you to listen. Because the main lesson that we want to get from this is that we got to learn how to be better gatekeepers of our own culture, be better gatekeepers of allowing people to just push upon us and get too comfortable with us. A lot of what I see in Richard Wersche Jr.'s situation, also known as White Boy Rick, is very, very similar to the Tekashi 6ix9ine situation, that was in New York City a couple of years ago. And what you have in both of these situations, and once again, I'm not somebody that's into prejudice or racism, but what I see is that you have these people, these foreigners, who are from, foreign ethnic national backgrounds. And because of the streets and the way that the so-called Black community has been broken down, these people are easily able to sliver and slide their way within our communities, and they find themselves in our groups, in our organizations, etc. Even today, you have, so-called Caucasian men who are claiming blood, claiming Crip, and these are actually Aboriginal gangs that were started by copper-colored American men. So one of the lessons before we go into this is that, and this isn't just for criminal street activity, this could be for legal activity as well. But understand that as a so-called Black American man, the way you are perceived by government and law enforcement will be different from men of other ethnic groups. And you will be targeted in a much harsher way. All right. Remember that I said in episode 1 that the Nixon administration during the 70s, going on into the 80s when the administrations changed, they started to use the quote unquote war on drugs as a way to attack the so-called Black community. And a lot of these drugs that were being brought in by the Italian-French connection, by the Colombians, and later on some of the Mexicans. But these drugs, this heroin, the dope, the fentanyl, the methamphetamine, etc., is allowed to come into these so-called Black communities because they're already impoverished. So they know that the people are going to, look for some type of an economic relief. And that's where the drugs come in. So just keep that in mind, all right? So let's look at some basic information on Mr. Richard Wersche Jr. Richard Wersche Jr. was born July 18th, 1969, known as, quote, White Boy Rick, end quote, is a United States former drug trafficker and Federal Bureau of Investigation, or FBI, informant. So what's very, very interesting, and the synchronicity to this is that today actually is July 18th. So today is Richard Wersche Jr.'s birthday. So I guess happy birthday to him. The youngest known informant in the history of the FBI, Wersche became a confidential informant when he was 14 to 16 years old. I'm going to repeat that part. The youngest known informant in the history of the FBI, Wersche became a confidential informant when he was 14 to 16 years old. When he was 15, Wersche told the FBI that a major drug dealer had spoken of paying bribe to Detroit detective inspector and subsequent city council president and mayoral candidate Gil Hill in order to quash the investigation into a 13-year-old boy's murder. At the age of 17, Wersche was arrested for possession of 8 grams of cocaine, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment. In 2017, justice campaigners publicized Wersche's case, and he was subsequently paroled, but directly to a prison in Florida to serve another 5 years for an auto theft conviction from 2008. Campaigners for Wersche have suggested to reporters that the length of his incarceration may have been connected to him having provided the FBI with information to the arrest of members and associates of former Detroit Mayor Coleman A. Young, as well as the allegation about Young's political ally Hill. In 2016, a notorious former Detroit hitman alleged Hill had once tried to commission the murder of Wersche. So the first thing that we want to point out is that White Boy Rick is the youngest known informant in the history of the FBI. And through some of my background investigation, I found out that his father actually was an arms dealer, or he was providing guns and ammunition and arms to different, criminal enterprises in the Detroit area. And his father had gotten caught up in certain, criminal situations, and the authorities apprehended him. So his father actually was an informant before he was. Okay. So the first thing you got to notice that White Boy Rick was, not only was he an informant, but his father was an informant. So as they say before, sometimes when it comes to these either Freemasonic organizations or some of these groups, you have these people that are second generation or legacy members. So almost Richard Wersche Jr., White Boy Rick, he was a legacy or a second descendant snitch or rat for the government. All right. I don't know if his father was an informant for the state of Michigan or for the federal government, but nevertheless, he was an informant. And we also want to point out that this dude, White Boy Rick, at 14, 15 years old, that means he was in about the 9th grade. Okay. He was in about the 9th grade. So the Federal Bureau of Investigation was so thirsty to try to crack down on some of the quote unquote street activity in Detroit. And also they were very, very thirsty to take down some of the quote unquote black leadership that was running Detroit as well. So Detroit had a so-called black mayor. A lot of the police staff was so-called black men. And some of the other governmental officials that were running the city of Detroit, they were so-called black. So you had certain, parties and groups that were not too fond of this. And if you don't believe that ethnicity and nationality if you don't think that has anything to do with the streets, then you're crazy. You're crazy. As I said, Nixon admitted that the so-called black community was going to be a target for the war on drugs. But so-called black Americans are not importing the drugs. They may distribute it once it's in the states, but they're not actually getting the drugs in, which is one of the hardest parts. So, on a higher level, these governmental officials, the authorities, the FBI, the CIA, these different Freemasonic groups, they already understand what's going to happen. And a lot of this is premeditated and pre-set up. So this is the situation that was going on in Detroit. So in order to, get away into destroying the different so-called black governmental politicians and law enforcement in Detroit, they had to figure out a way to infiltrate these families. Okay. And one of the way they were going to do it was through this guy, White Boy Rick. Now, Coleman A. Young, who I believe was one of the first so-called black mayors in Detroit, he was the mayor at the time during White Boy Rick's situation. And this gentleman by the name of Gil Hill, actually, I believe, was a homicide investigator in Detroit. So these were some of the big time players that it appears the FBI and certain other officials, wanted to take down. And this isn't necessarily my opinion. A little bit of it is my opinion, but it's also coming from interviews that I've heard from certain men, in particular, Mr. Tommy Curry. We'll go a little bit deeper into Curry because he's really one of the central key players in the whole White Boy Rick story anyway. All right. So as I said, White Boy Rick, or so-called White Boy Rick, or Richard Wersche Jr., he was born on July 18, 1969. And his father was an informant. And according to White Boy Rick himself, he said for the period that he was working as an informant for the government. I believe between the ages of like 14, 15, he said he made about $30,000 providing intel into the Detroit underworld, such as like, how are the drugs getting in, who's distributing the drugs, who are some of the major power players, who are the kingpins, what kind of law enforcement or police authorities are helping these so-called black organizations get the drugs in, et cetera, et cetera. And this is what White Boy Rick was used to get this information to provide to the authorities. While he was becoming familiar with some of these different kingpins in the drug underworld, there was a gentleman by the name of Johnny Curry, who was from the east side of Detroit, if I'm not mistaken. And he was one of the top men, during his time period of distributing, and he had his own empire. But as we can see, Mr. Curry was born in 1959, okay? So he was about 10 years older than White Boy Rick. And according to Mr. Curry, White Boy Rick actually became associated with him through one of his younger brothers. So there was a 10-year age difference. Also, Mr. Curry was already into the drug game, the streets, and he was getting a lot of money. So when White Boy Rick met them, they were already up. Okay, they were already up, and they had already been doing what they were doing. And in a little while, we'll go a little bit deeper into Mr. Curry in a minute. So, what you have now is, you got White Boy Rick acting as this informant, hanging with people on the east side of Detroit who are leaders in the drug game. And the FBI wants to use him as an informant to get information. There was a big boxing match with Marvin Hagler I think it was around 1985 in Las Vegas. So the authorities wanted to finance White Boy Rick and send him out there to get information, or at least as much information as he could, into this situation. So you'll also see a similarity with White Boy Rick's situation and also with Mr. Frank Lucas. If you've ever seen the movie American Gangster, that was probably about a decade before this. Is that when you go to these public events, these boxing matches, today it would be the basketball games, the football games, etc. But these public events where they know a lot of high rollers, big time players are going to show up. This is where you're going to have a lot of informants and snitches, people wearing wires, wiretaps, surveillance. A lot of that is going to be going on. You also saw this in Narcos on Netflix. I can remember it was an episode where it was the Cali cartel, I think, that they were investigating. And it was like a party or something that they were throwing where they were going to try to consolidate and bring everybody under one umbrella. And I think this is after Pablo Escobar was killed. So what the CIA and the local authorities were doing is they were sending informants to this big gathering or this big party. Okay, so just keep that in mind. You're going to see that as a common thing in these situations. So at about the age of 17, White Boy Rick actually was arrested and he was sentenced to life in prison because he got caught with possession of cocaine in excess of 8 grams. And I believe during his time period in the state of Michigan, if you got caught with over a certain amount of grams in cocaine, there were some very, very harsh mandatory minimums. So that's how he ended up getting that life sentence, all right, at such a young age, at 17 years old. So although he was an informant for the police, but just like Osama bin Laden with the CIA, a lot of the times these guys will break off these agents and they will start to actually become what they were sent as undercover. They will actually start being that for real. So although they may have started out being paid by the CIA or the FBI or the United States government to be either an agent for them, etc., it'll get to a point where they try to break off and actually start making money for real because they get knee deep in that underworld. All right. So it appears that this is also the case with White Boy Rick. So eventually, as I said, White Boy Rick, he gets sent to prison. But he comes up with, well, actually, he didn't come up with it, but the authorities approach him and they want to figure out how to take down, Coleman, Gil Hill, and remember, like some of these other so-called black politicians in law enforcement that they thought were corrupt. And the reason why they thought they were corrupt is because these Caucasian law enforcement know how corrupt they are when they have power. So anytime so-called black people are doing something, even if no illegal activity is going on, you're always going to be watched as if it is. Think about a lot of the so-called black entertainment executives and companies, whether it was Death Row, Bad Boy, Murder Inc., etc., Cash Money. There's always going to be this, well, where did the initial investment come from? Where did the installment money come from to start the business? Where did that original capital come from? Because they know that so-called black men, in the most part, come from families that don't have resources. There really isn't much generational wealth set up. And then a lot of these communities where these men come from that start these companies, they know that, the average income of this whole community is what, 30,000, 20,000, 40,000, depending on what the areas are. So the likelihood of you having all this money to start this business is very, very low. So where did it come from? All right. So what we want to do now is we want to shift gears and we want to look into Mr. Tommy Curry's story, because he's actually, who this was. He was one of the main key players in this. I would say Mr. Tommy Curry, the mayor, Coleman, and some of the people associated with them. That's really who the federal government wanted to take down. So Mr. Curry was actually, he was born in 1959 and he was from the South originally. So just like Nicky Barnes, you're going to find out that a lot of these brothers that went into the Northeast, New York, New Jersey, the ones that went to the Midwest, Chicago, Illinois, Detroit, and the ones that went out to California, Los Angeles, to the West Coast, a lot of these were part of the Great Migration in these families. Like Frank Lucas, for example, I think he was from North Carolina, but he was selling drugs up in New York. So I just want to put out there that, a lot of these brothers be from the South. So, when it comes to really getting money and stuff like that and that entrepreneurial mentality, you see it coming out of the South very, very hard. All right. So, Mr. Curry, according to him, growing up, his family did struggle a little bit financially because he said his father worked multiple jobs. His mother was a stay-at-home mom and he had multiple siblings. So, just keeping food on the table, just like most so-called black families, it can be a challenge. I think at some point his mother died. I think she had like some kind of a blood vessel in her brain, or some type of malfunction, and this led to her death. And, and Mr. Curry did say that this did kind of send him off mentally a little bit, because that was his mother. And, I guess around this subsequent to this, he had an older brother in Detroit who was already involved in the streets. So one of his older brothers helped him get, involved in the drug game. And he started out with the marijuana. OK. So, as his time in the drug game progresses, he said that his first ex-wife, she had an uncle that was actually connected to the Gambino family in New York. So he had connections to New York. And the Gambino family were the ones to give him access to the heroin. So he went from marijuana, and then he said he basically started sticking to the heroin because, of course, it made more money, and then you don't need as much space to house it. So you could have, let's say, 1 brick or 1, kilo of heroin, and that'll make more than even, let's say, 20, 30 pounds of marijuana. So that's why you start seeing a lot of these guys shift to these other drugs like heroin, cocaine, etc. It's more dangerous dealing it because the people become more addicted. And also because it makes more money, you're going to have a lot of violence and rivalry. But that's a chance, obviously, they take. And then eventually he started to add cocaine to his operation. So this is something that he had going on. And, and he was getting money on the east side of Detroit with a couple of other, people that were popular at that time. Mr. Curry then goes on to say that eventually he met his wife. I don't know if he's still married to the woman today, but the woman's name is Kathy. All right. The woman's name is Kathy. Her last name actually was Volson, I want to say, Kathy Volson. And she was actually the niece of the mayor of Detroit at that time. So what are the odds, or what are the likelihood that one of the top drug dealers on the east side of Detroit, randomly out doing his thing, probably meeting different women, of course, but he comes across one woman that I guess he's very, very interested in, and she just so happens to be the niece of the mayor of Detroit. So, he hooks up with her, and eventually I think he has, children with her. But we got to remember that she's the niece of the mayor of Detroit. So that means he now has access to law enforcement and, not saying that he was bribing law enforcement, but basically using some of his resources to safeguard himself in the streets as far as making sure packs come in, making sure he can get, drops and information on a certain investigation that local police had against him, etc. So, that connection to his wife, it opened up that door for him. Okay. So this is what gave him access to the Detroit police. And, he started to go deeper into his career. So, something else Mr. Curry said, that he said that White Boy Rick's father actually used to do arms deals with them. So he was doing deals with White Boy Rick's father, and didn't really deal with White Boy Rick because remember, White Boy Rick is about 10 years younger than him. So he actually said White Boy Rick was cool with one of his younger brothers, and that's how White Boy Rick was even around. Okay. So that's how he comes into the picture. But Curry stated that White Boy Rick's father already had been an arms dealer and already was an informant. But they didn't know anything about White Boy Rick, the son, being an informant. Around 1984, the federal government started to open up an investigation against Curry. And around April 2nd of 1987, he was indicted by the federal government with a couple of charges, including tax evasion and also the RICO. So remember, we said in that prior tape that this RICO, they're going to use the RICO to come against organizations. They use it against Young Thug in the state of Georgia. They use it against various Italian mobsters in New York. And now you see them using it right here against the Curry organization in Detroit. All right. This is 1987. So I want you to also keep in mind that in the 80s and the early 90s, this is where you start to see a lot of these drug empires start to fall. This is where these drug empires start to fall, like the late 80s, the 90s. A lot of the ones in New York, Detroit, they started to crumble at this time period. And of course, you just had other people pick up. But nevertheless, those golden days or those heydays, that started to end around that late 80s, early 90s. And the game got much more cutthroat because something else that Curry stated was that, during his time when they were selling drugs, everybody was getting money, and it was so much money that, the violence wasn't as high because everybody was able to do their thing. But he said when a lot of these younger guys started to come in the game, this started to increase the violence. So that's not only did I hear that about Detroit, but I also heard that about New York. Because when we go into some of the stuff that was happening in New York, a lot of these guys was 15, 16, 17 years old, making millions and millions and millions of dollars, committing big crimes, bringing in 100 kilos of cocaine, heroin, etc. So these dudes were extremely young. Their brains were underdeveloped. Some of them were still going through puberty or just ending puberty. Highly emotional. So this is a bad recipe for disaster. And that's why you see a lot of brutality going on in these situations. But anyway, to conclude the whole situation, what ended up happening is that when Curry goes to prison, he ends up getting about 14 years because he basically took a plea and he didn't want to go to trial. But also he didn't snitch or tell on anybody. So he didn't tell on any authorities in Detroit police that he was working with. He didn't tell on any politicians. He didn't give up any of his plugs. So, at least with that, he remained and kept his integrity because from his own mouth, he understood what he signed up for when it comes to the streets. He knew that, he enjoyed the money. He enjoyed the lifestyle. But if things were ever to go wrong, he would lose it all. He would have to just do his time like a man because that's the decision he made. So that's why he felt like, it wasn't no point of telling on anybody. But anyway, what ended up happening was while White Boy Rick was locked up, the federal government approached him because they still wanted to get Coleman and these other Detroit power players. So they came up with an operation called Operation Backbone, which was an undercover sting to get these corrupt politicians and law enforcement in in Detroit rather, get them on camera, get them on wiretap, so we can get them in trouble. Now, this is what ended up happening that is very, very interesting. When Curry is locked up, White Boy Rick starts to have an affair with Curry's wife. Okay, so the woman, Kathy Volson, Curry's wife, the niece of the mayor of Detroit, She starts messing with this guy, white boy Rick. Okay, so she starts to create her own personal relationship with him. And according to Curry, his wife was a drug addict. All right, I don't know which drug she was on, but according to him, she was a drug addict. So the government then used this relationship between white boy Rick and Curry's wife to set up an operation where they were going to have white boy Rick tell Curry's wife that, look, I got a plug in Miami who really is an undercover agent, and he's going to come up and y'all going to talk, and basically he's going to need y'all's connections to the police in Detroit, so when the dope and the shipment come in, it can get there safely and the police will get paid. All right. So what ended up happening was there was two members, from the Coleman regime. One of them was a deputy police and the other one was like a brother-in-law of the mayor. And they got these guys on camera and on wiretap basically doing this deal where they agreeing to be paid. They talking about how many other members they got on the police task that are corrupt that can help with this whole operation, et cetera, et cetera. So they go through with it. And then, of course, the authorities bust in on them. And then they arrest the brother-in-law of the mayor and also this deputy police. And they also arrest Kathy Volson Curry, okay, for being involved in this. So, according to the authorities, they said that white boy Rick, quote, may have been the best FBI drug informant in Michigan history. All right. And also they wanted to try to get that man, Gil Hill, who was the lead of the homicide unit. And when Gil Hill started to see a lot of those, powerful politicians around him going down, of course he got nervous. I don't know what his involvement was with any of it, but he got nervous. And according to a hitman from Detroit by the name of Nate Boone Craft, some of you I may have heard of him, but according to him, he was hired by Gil Hill to assassinate or kill white boy Rick, to stop white boy Rick from talking so much and giving up information because it could destroy everything that they had worked for. And according to Nate Boone Craft, he attempted to kill white boy Rick twice, but he was unsuccessful. And eventually white boy Rick got locked up and sent to prison, and so did Nate Boone Craft. He got locked up and sent to prison. And both of them also became federal informants as well. All right. So to conclude this, I want to just say, white boy Rick eventually got out of prison around, I think, July of 2020. And right now, he got out in July of 2020. And, I think he's in his 50s now. So he's out. Tommy Curry is out, but understand that, man, there really is no real honor in the streets. And whenever you get the pressure cooker put on you, it's going to come down to your morality and the principles you're standing on from so-called street code and individual survival. Did white boy Rick become an informant because he wanted to try to get his dad out of trouble with the federal government? Maybe, maybe not. But nevertheless, this is the situation, and this dude was extremely young when he was involved in all this too. So, so-called black American men, you all just need to be a little more cognizant and aware of when you're doing criminal activity, who you have around, even if it's another so-called black man who's a rat, or he's weak, or has a drug problem, or, gets in trouble. And when he gets pinched, in order to relieve himself, he's willing to tell on somebody. Whatever the case is you got to be a master of, understanding psychology and behavior. But the truth is that you really never know if somebody's going to stand on 10 until everything hits the fan. And the truth is you don't want to be in that circumstance to find out. OK, so this is episode 2 of Green Box Politics. Hit us up in the comment section. I'm out.